Good morning, theorists. Hello.
Gosh.
I'm here with Annika and Megan, and we're going to teach you about modulations. Good times. And then eventually we're going to talk about 15-1 and 15-2 odds for Friday. And if you can't be in the classroom, then just, good thing we have that OneDrive to make sure we can keep up with the homework. Hopefully by now you've read chapter 15, and the first thing you notice is what we've referred to as closely related keys. And we talk about this all the time when we say every key signature has two interpretations. And so if I draw a key signature like this, no sharps, no flats, we know that that's the key of C or A minor. Yeah, we have Do or La. Okay. The first page of chapter 15 simply states that a closely related key would then be to add an accidental or take one away. And so we've got quite a few options here. I could add a sharp, in which case we would have, Annika, what major key?
G.
G. Megan, what minor key?
Is it E?
Yeah. Okay. And I could also take away the sharp and instead go the other direction, add one flat. In which case, Megan, what's my major?
F.
F. And the minor?
That's a great question. I don't know.
D.
D. Okay. You just go down to.
Oh.
Whenever, and this happens with my voice students all the time, I give them a sight reading example, I ask them what key it's in, and they say G. And I'm like, that is one option. What's the other option? And they look up at the ceiling like they're thinking about it. Don't think about it. Look at the staff. Don't look up. Look at the staff. Here's a G, 1, 2. I go down a third to E. Real simple to find these relative minors. Okay? Don't look up. Look at the staff. So now, the point of the first page of chapter 15 is to say a composer can start in the key of C or A minor, and all of a sudden they start adding F sharps to the piece, and they have essentially modulated either to G or E, G major or E minor. Or they start flatting the Bs in their music, and the tonal center kind of shifts. It modulates toward F major or D minor. And so we'll see lots of examples of that, and you have seen lots of examples of that all your life. We're going to come back to that when we get to assignment 15-1. There are three types of modulations. First, there is the common chord modulation. And when we refer to that chord in music, we'll call it the pivot chord, because this is a chord that relates well to the original key, and it also exists in the new key. It happens right before the composer adds or takes away an accidental. And so if we look at page 316, you have figure 15-2 there.
Yeah.
On 316. we see in measure 6 that the composer was originally in the key of D with 2 sharps in the key signature. Well, I know that the key of D is closely related to adding 1 more sharp to the key signature. So I've got F sharp, C sharp, my next sharp would be a G sharp, that's the key of A. Or I could take 1 sharp away and start naturalizing the C's. And so I've got F sharp and C sharp, but the composer starts putting in C naturals. Now essentially I'm reduced to 1 sharp in the key signature. This is the key of G, or any of the relative minors. So we have 2 sharps in the key signature. We get to measure 6, and the composer adds a G sharp, first in the bass clef, then in the treble clef. That's kind of a tonal center shift. We felt like we were in D, and now all of a sudden it feels like there are 3 sharps in the key signature, because we've essentially added that 3rd sharp. And so right before that happens, we can identify a pivot chord, a chord that exists both in the key of D and in the new key that I think I'm modulating toward, which is A. And so I back up to the middle of measure 5, and I see a B minor chord. So this is a 6 chord in first inversion. In my new key, that would be minor 2, 6. And we see that underneath measure 5. We're calling that the pivot chord, or in this case, it's kind of the pivot area because it occurs over beats 3 and 4. We just snowman out all those pitches. Probably need to circle some non-harmonics there, some passing tones, but essentially we're left with a B minor chord, which exists in the key of D, and it also exists in our new key of A. That's kind of hard to determine in the moment. So what I do is I look at that accidental, and then I go clear to the end. I want to see where we're cadencing. How does this cadence? And that makes it really pop. If I'm not sure what key we're going to, I look at the end of measure 7 and the beginning of measure 8, and I see 5, 1. Oh, that's a perfect authentic cadence, but not in the key of D. Now that looks a lot like the key of A. And so then I back up to measure 6, and I realize I've got 2 sharps in the key signature. It looks like we're adding a 3rd, which resembles the key of A, which is confirmed by the cadence at the end of the phrase. And so I'm just going to back up to the middle of measure 5 and identify that pivot chord, the place where it looks like these 2 keys have 1 chord in common, at least 1 chord. Make sense?
Kind of.
Okay. All right, so we've got the common chord modulation. That's our first example. The second example is chromatic. And this occurs when they don't have a common chord. The composer adds an accidental, and it's just a dramatic shift. It happens on the spot. We were in this key on this beat. Now it feels like a totally different key on the very next beat. There's no sort of gradual modulation. It's just sudden. And this type of music can be very dramatic because it doesn't really set you up for any sort of preparation. It just happens all of a sudden. And there's a major difference the way we analyze these with Roman numerals and brackets. The common chord we see in figure 15.2 how we're going along in the key of D, analyzing all our Roman numerals until we get to the middle of measure 5. I got a minor 6 in first inversion, and then I get to that next chord and it's got a G sharp in it. I'm like, wait a second, this feels like a new key. It happens to be the third sharp, closely related to the key of D. Now I'm in the key of A. Could I analyze this 6th chord in the key of A? If so, that's probably a pivot for a common chord modulation. And so I'm going to bracket above there, above the 6, I'm going to write my new key, and I'm going to write the Roman numeral on a new plane underneath it. And then I'm going to continue that plane and analyze the rest of the piece on this lower plane until I get to my cadence, my PAC. Okay? We see on page 317 that the shift can be sudden. And then it just stays on the same plane. So for chromatic then, I'm going along in the key of G, and then all of a sudden, the composer puts a D sharp in there, and I realize, oh, we've shifted to the relative minor, and the reason the composer raised the D up to D sharp is because that serves as the third of a 5 chord in a minor key. So it happens all of a sudden. I think it's a little bit more difficult to recognize when there's no pivot chord. But if I back up on figure 15.3, let me just finish this thought. Here, we have no bracket, we have no planes, we just keep going on the same line. Okay, so that's a major difference between common chord analysis and chromatic modulation analysis. So if I back up to 15.3, beat 1 of the first full measure, I have a D chord. Well, that D chord does not exist in the key of E minor. I mean, maybe you could say that's a major 7, but it's a little bit of a stretch. On that E chord, it's particularly dramatic because in the tenor voice, we've been on D, and now we're shifting to the D sharp, which gives it a clearly different tonal center. Feels like we're in a different key. The third type is probably the easiest to identify, and it's a bit more rare than the others, the phrasal modulation. Or just phrase. If it ends one phrase, like we see in figure 15.4, and then starts a new phrase, and this one's significant because the repeats, how it cadences in one key, and then it takes away the sharps that it had previously and starts a new phrase without the accidentals that existed before. Pretty clear indication that I'm in a new key and it happened in between phrases. So that one is also quite sudden, as is the chromatic modulation. Okay, so down at the bottom of page 319, they emphasize how to write the differences. And I didn't give an example here for the phrase modulation. They're in E minor, and then there's a major stop, and then they start a new section in a new key. And these are closely related because E minor has one sharp. If you take that away, you could be in C major or A minor. And so these are closely related keys, but they're analyzed on the same plane, and we end one phrase with a cadence. We probably have something fairly significant as far as the measure markings. In this case, there's repeat signs, or at least a double bar, and then they start a new phrase in a new key. And so it's pretty apparent, but we analyze that all on the same plane. So that in that way, it looks somewhat similar to the chromatic modulation. Common chord, pretty distinct. With the bracket and the two separate planes, those are the differences between our modulation types. And they emphasize that at the bottom of page 319 with the bracket versus the same plane. A few historical applications listed on 321. And so I invite you to double check all this information and try to synthesize that as we prepare for assignments 15.1 and 15.2. Actually, I lied, not odds. Let's see, 15.1 we need to do all of that, and 15.2 we can do the odds. So 15.1 is all. Okay, let's take a look at it. Basically, they're just wanting you to identify closely related keys. And I have a preference here. And this requires a little bit of terminology that we need to dust off because we haven't used it in a little while. For the given example, they say number one, we've got, I need a little more space here. On number one, they give the example of G major. So I'm going to write it. And I literally wrote all these staffs in the margin just to make sure that I was accounting for everything. So on number one, they give you the key of G. That's what we'll just call the original key. Then they say that is closely related to C and D. So they took care of all the majors first. How does C relate to G? That's the subdominant. It's the fourth degree of the scale. So if I'm here and then here, instead of calling that the 4, I'm going to call it the subdominant. The D then is the 5, the dominant. And then I'm going to go to the relative minor. And so here, if my original key was G, then I know the relative minor is here, so they gave us an E. Then we need the subdominant of the relative. Okay, so I'm just going to do the same thing I did for G, but now I'm going to do it in the relative minor. A fourth higher than E is A minor, and a fifth higher than E is going to be B minor. So here I'm going to call this the relative subdominant. And I'm going to call this the relative dominant. So sub just means underneath. So we've got the dominant and the subdominant. Basically, we're just traveling the circle of fifths to find the closely related keys. In this case, we found we're in the key of G, we take the sharp away to find the subdominant, or we can add a sharp to find the dominant. Here we're back to our original key to find the relative minor, and then I'm going to take sharp away to find the relative subdominant, or I'm going to add a sharp to the original key to get my relative dominant. So we see how these keys are closely related. Here I've got G and its relative, then I've got the subdominant and its relative, and I've got the dominant and its relative minor key.
Well, can you explain why you did the two sharps and the no sharp? Is it just, oh wait, just cause like in C there's no sharps and D there's two sharps and...
A closely related key is when you take an accidental away or add one.
Okay.
Good question. And so here, I had one sharp in the original key, I took it away, and that resulted in the key of C. Or I went back to the original key, and I added one accidental, and I came up with D, which serves as the dominant of G. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because on the rest of these, I want you to do first the subdominant, then the dominant, then the relative key, and I'm not saying relative minor because they might give you a minor key and you have to find the relative major. So find the relative, and then the subdominant of the relative, and then the dominant of the relative key. Okay? Let's do one more together. How about number 2 is F minor. So what is the key signature?
Is that A major? Or wait.
D major.
A has an F sharp in it.
Was D major? No. Yeah.
Well, it is some form of A, but it's not A major. It needs to be A something that has an F in it, and not an F sharp.
A flat.
A flat. Good.
Piano.
Oops. Okay. Okay, F minor has 4 flats in it. Now I want to find, and that occurs right here. Now I want to find the subdominant. I go up 4, and I'm going to find the minor keys first. Just like they did up here, they keep the modality the same. So first they did the majors, then they did the relative minors of the original key, the subdominant, the dominant, and then the relative keys of the original, the subdominant, the dominant. So let's keep that order. So I go up to the subdominant, and my minor key is B flat. I go up to the fifth, and in which case B flat minor has 5 flats in the key signature, right? Okay, I go to the dominant of F, and I've got C minor, which is 3 flats. So first I added a flat, and I got B flat minor. Then I took my 4 flats, I took one away, and I ended up with the key signature for C minor. So here I've got the subdominant, and I've got the dominant.
So you said B flat minor has 5 flats, or B
Yeah.
flat major?
B flat minor.
Okay. B flat is,
It's the same as D flat major. We're getting there in just a second, right?
okay, sorry, I was just trying to connect.
So then I'm gonna go to the relative key. 4 flats is A flat major. Then I'm going to add a flat to find, I'm gonna find the 4th, yes. 4 above A is D flat. Well, the key signature for D flat major is 5 flats, so that's closely related. And then I'm gonna go to the dominant, and E flat major has 3 flats. So now I started with F minor, and my closely related key is A flat major. Then I went up to the subdominant, and B flat is the same key signature as D flat. That's 5 flats. I started with my original 4, and I just added 1 more. And then my dominant of F minor is C minor with 3 flats. The relative of that is E flat. And so here I've got the relative key, and then the subdominant of the relative. And the relative of the dominant. So I'd like you to go ahead and write in above the categories on number 1, write above the C, write subdominant. Above the D, write dominant. Above the relative key, I'm going to write relative. Above the A, I'm going to write the relative of the subdominant. And above our last category here, I'm going to write relative of the dominant. And that way we can present all the answers in the same order. First, you have the given key. Then you have 4 notes higher, the subdominant. Then you have 5 notes higher, the dominant. Then you go to the relative key. Then you go 4 notes higher than the relative. Then you go 5 notes higher than the relative. And we end up with all these closely related keys. Let's keep them in that order. Yeah.
So, there's like the note in parentheses, so that's gonna be whether or not it's minor, minor, minor first, or major first.
I think I understand, and you are correct.
So like in that first one, in parentheses on our assignment, it would be a major. That second one in
Yeah,
parentheses,
since
it would
it's
be a minor.
uppercase.
Okay,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
So, if I'm going to do all that work on a separate sheet of paper, do you want me to turn this in as well?
Either way, if you look at the given key and just go up 4, that's your next answer. And then go up 1 more, that's your next answer. And then go to the relative key, that's your next answer. And then go up 4, and that's your next answer. And go up 1 more, that's your next answer. So it's very organized into specific things that we're looking for, and by identifying the subdominant, the dominant, the relative key, the subdominant of the relative, and the dominant of the relative, we've found all the closely related keys by taking one accidental away from the original and then adding one accidental to the original. You'll be great.
I think it's just needing to settle in.
Let's look at 15.2. Okay. Let's try number let's try number 2 together, and then we'll see if we need to do another one. Okay? I should have enough space. I'm gonna erase a little bit here. Okay. Is that still recording?
Let's see. Yeah, it is.
Okay, good. All right. Number 2. Here is 15.2, number 2. I've got sharp in the key signature, common time. And then if I analyze these real quick, I see that I start with a G chord. And we've got a key signature of G. So I'm pretty confident that we're in G major with a 1 chord. And so all you need to do is write down the Roman numerals and notice when it changes keys. On the first full measure, we've got soprano, alto. I'm just going to fill these in real quick. And then here and here. And then the tenor voice goes D, D, E, and E, D, and ends on C. And the bass voice, F natural, E, D, I'm gonna circle that, E. If you identify the non-harmonics, I'll give you extra credit. If you identify the cadence, I'll give you extra credit. But if we look at the directions, it basically just says, identify the modulation. And the only way you can do that is to really analyze every chord with Roman numerals. So I notice my first accidental here is an F natural. I only had one accidental in the key signature, and now we're taking it away already. And then we've got a G sharp over here. This looks interesting. If I analyze this chord, I've got F and D and A. So this is just 5/6. And then I've got F and D and A minor. That's a D minor chord. Weird. I think there's some sort of modulation occurring here.
Could be chromatic.
And then I right away want to check for the cadence. And I see 5, 1. Oh. Well, if this is 1, that's the key of A. And I don't have a C sharp, so I'm thinking this must be A minor. The reason there's a sharp here is because they wanted to make the 5 chord major. 5, 1 for a PAC, and I'm going to mark my passing tone here and my neighboring tone here. This is a sudden shift because I'm going from a D major chord to a D minor chord, and then here I've got E. Oh, that's an A chord, A minor chord. Oh.
Oh boy.
I don't know if you can see that on the video, but this was a rather sudden shift, that it went from a D major chord to a D minor chord, and I couldn't tell what key I was in. All I knew was I took the F sharp away. From that perspective, I'm either going to C major or A minor. And it cadences in A minor. And I look at this cadential sequence. I've got a 1-6-4, which is not a stable chord. I mean, anytime you've got second inversion or third inversion chords, those are not stable. Not like a root position chord. That's not stable. So I would say beats 2 and 3, the composer is intentionally creating some sort of ambiguity, some sort of instability in order to shift from one key to the next. And in this case, it's a sudden shift. And so I just write chromatic in the blank provided. And we have identified our first modulation in chromatic style. What you got?
I'm just curious as to why we did the 5-1 at the end when we didn't know what the key was yet. I don't know why we started there.
Well, because I knew, I guess I could have hypothesized back here that I have an F sharp, I'm taking it away, so I'm either in C or A. And so then I look at the cadence, and that pretty much solidified the fact that I am modulating, and I'm not going to C. I'm going to A. So that F natural was a major indicator that I've got one sharp in the key signature, now I'm taking it away. The only reason we've got a G sharp here is so we can raise the third of the 5 chord in a minor key. And so I kept all the Roman numerals and the new key on the same plane, as opposed to a common chord modulation where I've got this pivot where one chord exists in both keys. There's no D major chord in the key of A minor. So this was an abrupt change. And it was made most obvious because I went literally from a D major chord to a D minor chord. It was so sudden that I could not identify a pivot, because a D major chord in the key of A minor, that would be a major 4. Well, a major 4 does not exist in A minor. So I knew this was a sudden shift. I feel like the common chord modulations are a little bit easier to identify. You just go to the accidental, back up one chord, and see if you can analyze that chord in both keys. If so, then you analyze it in the first key, bracket, analyze it in the second key. How do you identify the second key? You look at what accidental is added, or in this case, taken away. And then you look at the cadence to confirm your suspicion. Number one, that we're moving to a new key. Number two, what that key is according to the given cadence. And as a result, if you can analyze this chord right before the accidental, if you can identify this chord in both keys, do it. If you can't, like I could not here, I couldn't back up one chord from the accidental and analyze that in both keys. It was just a very sudden shift. And so our puzzles just keep getting more and more fun. But it does require some advanced thinking, and that's a value in our country, it seems to be.
Oh gosh.
Anyhow, so you just need to do number 1, 3, and 5 on 15.2. And what's going to be tricky about that? Just give it some thought. And obviously we are not seeing any phrase modulations because there's no major break in a 2-measure excerpt, right? A 2-measure little phrase. There's only one little phrase here, so it can't be a phrase modulation. So you've got a 50-50 chance. You might guess and get them all right. But the thing that determines how you fill in the blank is your Roman numeral analysis and identifying that cadence in the new key. They all change keys. Some of them do it abruptly as a chromatic modulation. Some of them do it with a pivot chord for a common chord modulation. And you can analyze the chord right before the accidental in both keys. The original key and the key you're going to according to the cadence. Questions?
Can I ask you one on this one?
Sure.
So I noticed that on number 1, so like within the first 3, the G, C, D one, you did the original, and then you took one accidental away, and then you showed that like you didn't have any there, and then the next one you added one. So like in the bottom one with F minor, you didn't have to add any in the little.
You gonna make me write all these?
I'm sorry, I just.
Oh
like,
my gosh!
It was just easy, like it's easy to visualize, or
Yeah.
better to visualize it, I guess. So like, then, is it going to be the same pattern throughout with the original? You take one away, and then the next measure you add one, and then the last 3 measures are kind of like the relative stuff.
Looks like it.
Wait, why
Okay.
did you flip them? Why are they flipped?
What do you mean?
Like for the subdominants, you added one on the flat key. On the dominants, you took away one.
Oh.
So are those flipped for flat keys then?
I think you're thinking too hard.
Wait,
Go up 4, go up 5. Find the relative. Go up 4, go up 5.
I think because like in the G one for subdominant, you took the accidental away.
And then you add one in for the dominant, so
Yep.
So then for the one that you're doing now, the original was 4. Wouldn't you take one away for subdominant? So would it be 3?
Not for the subdominant. You would for the dominant.
so they are flipped.
For the sake of, yeah,
Okay.
they are. But for the sake of organization, I want you to find the subdominant and then the dominant, and then the relative key, and then the fourth of that, and the fifth of that. So, you're right, and I don't know if it's because we started in a minor, or if it's because we started in a flat. I think it's flats because that uses the opposite direction of the circle of fifths.
Okay.
That'd be nice.
That makes
Okay,
sense.
so flats are opposite amount of,
Yeah.
just flip those sharps, okay.
If we're writing in the key signatures, but
I think it's easier to think about finding my tonic and go up 4
yeah.
to find the subdominant.
I think we would just use that to double check that we have them in the right.
Mm-hmm. So I'm finding the 4 and the 5, and then the relative is equal, and then find the 4 and the 5. Ooh. Kind of.
Get
Angry
that minor
Birds.
5 out of here.
Okay, what else?
I think that's it for now.
Do they have any questions over there?
Do you have any questions? Okay, I'm sorry you're in quarantine. We miss you, and we'll look forward to connecting very soon. Feel free to email me or text me any questions. Bye.